at least somebody is caring for their own body, right?
Yeah.
I mean, that's a good sign. You better train every part of your body.
Picture this. Time travel is real, and for the next few minutes, you're going to use it. We're pulling you backward through the decades, past the posters, past the highlight reels, straight into the mind and body of a man Chuck Norris once called the hardest worker he had ever seen in his life. Dana White, decades later, standing at the head of an entire sport built on cages and knockouts, would call this same man the father of mixed martial arts. That's not a small compliment. That's an entire industry looking backward and pointing at one person as the origin point. Without him, modern action cinema doesn't look the way it looks. The fight choreography you've grown up watching, the philosophy behind it, the rhythm of strike and recovery, the whole aesthetic of controlled violence on screen, all of it traces back to one man standing in a room, refusing to accept that his body had limits worth respecting. He didn't wear a cape, he wore a gi. And somehow, that was enough to make him look like a superhero anyway, moving faster than film cameras of the era could properly capture. His name was Bruce Lee. Think about that for a second. An actor, a philosopher, a man who spent as much time reading and writing about combat theory as he spent practicing it. And yet the physical layer underneath all of that thinking is what we're about to walk through today. Not the quotes people put on motivational posters. Not the 2-inch punch demonstrations that get replayed in slow motion online. The actual sets, the actual reps. The actual minutes spent running, cycling, and stretching that made the rest of it possible in the first place. Welcome. You're watching Athlete Specials, and today we're going somewhere most fitness channels don't bother going: underneath the myth, past the legend, into the actual mechanics of how Bruce Lee trained his body day after day, rep after rep. This isn't a highlight reel of famous quotes. This is the blueprint itself, broken down into the sets, the reps, the timing, and the sequencing that turned a wiry martial artist into one of the most conditioned human beings anyone had seen on screen. Stick around, because skipping even a section of this means missing a piece of what made him nearly indestructible. If you want more of these deep dives into the routines behind legendary athletes, the real numbers, not just the mythology, the subscribe button and the like button are right there. Hit them now, before the algorithm buries this channel under 1,000 other things competing for your attention. A body built like a weapon. Bruce Lee wasn't just a face on a movie poster. Underneath the on-screen charisma, underneath the calm stare and the effortless-looking movement, was a physical conditioning program so brutal that people still repeat stories about it decades after his death. Stories about training sessions so extreme that just hearing them secondhand has apparently made grown men queasy. Nobody's fainting on this channel today, though. We're simply going to lay out exactly what he did, piece by piece, session by session, and show you how to build a version of it into your own life without needing a stunt double. The man believed in balance, though not in the soft, forgiving sense that word usually carries. He meant something closer to completeness. No single type of training was ever enough on its own, no matter how hard you pushed it. Real fitness, in his view, required layering different systems on top of each other in the right order, preparing the body first, building raw strength second, conditioning the heart and lungs third, and never once skipping the steps that most people rush past on their way to the parts that feel more exciting. His full approach broke down into 4 connected phases: warming up and stretching, strength training, martial arts conditioning, and cardiovascular work. In every single session, without exception, began the exact same way: waking the body up. Before any hard training began, Bruce Lee spent real time waking his body up. This wasn't a throwaway, 5 minutes tacked onto the front of a workout out of obligation, the kind of half-hearted stretch most people do while already scrolling through their phone. He treated the warm-up as a call BSY, non-negotiable part of the process, because he understood something a lot of people still ignore even now. Cold muscles and stiff joints break down faster than warm, loosened ones. A rushed body gets hurt. A prepared one performs, and performs longer, without the nagging injuries that quietly end careers early, one small tear at a time. The purpose of a warm-up is simple enough on paper: push blood into the muscles, get the heart rate climbing, prime the nervous system for what's coming, but the payoff compounds over the following hour of training. Bruce Lee opened his sessions with jumping jacks, push-ups, and squats, using them purely to get circulation moving and joints loosened before anything more demanding began. Nothing fancy, nothing that required equipment or space, just movements that told the body it was time to switch into a higher gear. From there, he moved into stretching, and he treated the 2 disciplines within stretching as genuinely different tools with different jobs to do. Dynamic stretching came first: leg swings, arm circles, movements that carried his limbs through their full range of motion while the body was already warm from the initial movement. Then came static, holds positions like hamstring stretches and quad stretches, held in place for a set period of time, aimed at deepening flexibility rather than simply activating it the way the dynamic work had. But because he was, first and foremost, a martial artist and not just a gym goer chasing numbers, his warm-up didn't stop at generic mobility work borrowed from a textbook. He rolled his shoulders and stretched his neck, specifically to prepare his upper body for the demands of combat movement, where a stiff neck or a tight shoulder can slow a strike by a fraction of a second that matters. He threw kicks and punches to rehearse the exact patterns his training would demand later in the session. And often, he'd work a light bag or shadow box for a stretch, sharpening technique and timing while his body finished waking itself up around him. Only after all of that groundwork was laid did the real work begin, building the engine. Strength wasn't vanity to Bruce Lee, it was infrastructure, the load-bearing frame underneath everything else he wanted his body to do. He viewed physical power and overall conditioning as the foundation beneath every strike, every takedown defense, every extra round he could last past an opponent who hadn't trained as hard. His strength work split into two categories that ran alongside each other: loaded resistance training with barbells and dumbbells, and bodyweight-based conditioning that required nothing but his own mass and gravity. On the weight side, he leaned on classic, unglamorous movements, bench presses, deadlifts, dumbbell curls, and several others, each one chosen deliberately to hit a specific muscle group while still contributing to total body strength rather than isolated vanity muscle. There was nothing decorative in the selection. Every exercise had a job to do, whether that was building the kind of raw pressing power a strike depends on, or reinforcing the posterior chain that keeps a fighter stable under pressure. Here's how those sessions actually broke down, set by set, movement by movement. The clean and press, 2 sets of 8 repetitions. Start with the barbell resting on the ground, feet planted at shoulder width. Bend down. Take an overhand grip with the palms facing downward. Then drive the bar upward in one motion to shoulder height before pressing it straight overhead until the arms lock out. Lower it back down to the shoulders under control, then return it to the floor and repeat the sequence. Barbell squats, 2 sets of 12. Stand with feet at shoulder width, the barbell resting across the shoulders behind the neck. Bend the knees and lower into a squat while keeping the back straight and the chest up, then drive back up to standing, the bar still resting across the shoulders throughout the entire movement. The barbell pullover, 2 sets of 8. Lie on a bench with the head hanging slightly off one end, gripping the barbell at shoulder width above the chest. Lower the bar behind the head in a slow arc, feeling the stretch travel through the chest and the lats, then pull it back up along the same path and repeat. Bench press, 2 sets of 6. Lying flat on the bench, feet planted firmly on the ground, take the bar off the rack with a shoulder-width grip. Lower it slowly to the chest, elbows tucked in close to the body rather than flared outward, then press it back up to full extension with control. The good morning, 2 sets of 8. Standing with feet at shoulder width and the bar resting across the shoulders behind the head, bend forward at the waist with the back kept perfectly straight, hinging at the hips until the torso is roughly parallel to the floor. Reverse the motion by driving the hips forward and straightening the spine back to standing. The barbell curl, 2 sets of 8. Standing with feet at shoulder width, take an underhand grip on the bar with the hands close together. Curl it upward toward the chest by bending purely at the elbows, keeping the upper arms still, then lower it back down under control rather than letting it drop. Alongside all of that loaded work, he layered in bodyweight training that required nothing but discipline and a bit of open floor space. Push-ups, starting in a plank position, hands at shoulder width, lowering the chest until it nearly touches the floor before pressing back up, the body kept rigid and straight throughout the entire repetition. Pull-ups, hanging from a bar with an overhand, shoulder-width grip, pulling the body upward with the elbows tucked close to the sides, then lowering back down with control instead of dropping. And bodyweight squats, feet at shoulder width, toes turned slightly outward, lowering the hips and knees until the thighs reach parallel to the ground or a touch below, then driving back up through the legs and glutes to standing. Training the engine to last. Strength alone was never the finish line for Bruce Lee. He understood something that separates good athletes from great ones. A fighter who could hit like a truck in the first exchange but gassed out by the third round still lost. Endurance decided fights just as much as power did, and it decided them quietly, in the space between visible moments and how fast a fighter could recover between exchanges, in whether his hands were still fast in the final minute, the way they were in the first. So cardiovascular training became its own dedicated pillar of the routine, heart and lungs conditioned with the exact same seriousness as muscle, never treated as an afterthought squeezed in when time allowed. Running formed the backbone of this cardio work. He'd head out most days and cover 4 to 5 miles in around 30 minutes, often deliberately choosing tracks or hilly terrain instead of flat, forgiving ground, specifically to make the effort harder than it needed to be. If you're building a version of this into your own routine, a reasonable target to work toward is a comfortable paced jog that gradually builds speed over time, aiming to cover roughly 3 miles somewhere in the 20 to 30-minute range before pushing further. Jump rope was his second cardio weapon, and it did double duty in a way running couldn't, building endurance while simultaneously sharpening the exact footwork, rhythm, and coordination that martial arts demands from the feet upward. His sessions with the rope typically ran 15 to 20 minutes at a stretch, unbroken, the kind of monotonous-sounding work that quietly builds a different kind of toughness. It's the sort of training that looks almost boring from the outside, a single rope turning over and over in a small room, and yet it was building exactly the reflexes and footwork that made him look untouchable in the ring or on screen. Then came the interval work, short, brutal bursts of maximum effort followed by brief recovery, cycling through sprints, burpees, and jumping jacks in rotation. He's often credited as an early adopter of this style of interval-based conditioning, well before it became the standard gym floor staple it is today, packaged and sold under a dozen different brand names. Cycling rounded out the cardio rotation, whether on a stationary bike indoors or out on the open road, with sessions typically lasting 40 to 45 minutes at a stretch. The instruction here is straightforward if you want to try it yourself. Start at an easy, sustainable pace, and let both the intensity and the duration climb gradually as your fitness improves week over week, bringing the body back down. Nothing in Bruce Lee's system ended abruptly, and nothing was left half-finished. Cooling down mattered to him just as much as warming up did. It's the phase most people skip entirely once the hard work is technically done. Walking straight from the last rep to the shower without giving the body any transition at all, Bruce Lee didn't train that way. The cool down was the phase that let stiffness and soreness fade faster afterward and let the body settle back into its resting state gradually, instead of being left wound up, tense, and vulnerable to injury after hard effort. He'd typically close a session with a light jog or an easy walk, letting his heart rate drift back downward gradually rather than stopping cold and leaving his system shocked. 5 to 10 minutes of that alone made a measurable difference in how quickly his body recovered afterward. From there came static stretching, holding a position at the point of gentle tension for 15 to 30 seconds at a time, repeating each hold 2 to 4 times before moving on. Hamstrings, quads, and hip flexors were his usual targets, chosen based on whatever muscle group had taken the heaviest load during that particular session. Dynamic stretching made a second appearance here too, not just back in the warm-up, leg swings, arm circles, hip rotations, each performed for 10 to 12 repetitions per side, moving the joints through their full range while the body was still loose and warm from training rather than cold and tight. And finally, foam rolling, a form of self-administered muscle release that Bruce Lee used to work through tightness in the back, hamstrings, and calves, rolling slowly back and forth over each area for 30 to 60 seconds at a time until the tension underneath the skin began to ease and release. What it all adds up to. Strip away the mythology, strip away the movie posters and the highlight reels, and what's left is a genuinely disciplined system, martial arts drilling, structured strength work, and serious cardiovascular conditioning, all wrapped carefully in preparation and recovery on both ends of every single session. Nothing was left to chance. Nothing was skipped simply because it felt optional or boring compared to the flashier parts of training. That's arguably the least cinematic part of the entire story, and also the most important one. The discipline was never in the highlight reel moments, it was in the thousands of unremarkable repetitions that nobody was filming. If you wanted to build a version of this for yourself, the blueprint is right here in front of you. Start with a real warm-up and stretching routine. Instead of skipping straight to the hard part, add strength work built around push-ups, pull-ups, and squats. Layer in cardio through running or jump rope on a consistent schedule, and never skip the cool down and stretch waiting at the end. Do that consistently, week after week, and you're following the same underlying architecture that built one of the most conditioned bodies of the 20th century, not the mythology of it, but the actual mechanics. So here's the question worth sitting with for a moment. How much of your own training is genuinely structured like this: warm-up, strength, cardio, recovery, in that order, and how much of it is just the parts you feel like doing on any given day? Before you go try to replicate any of this, talk to a qualified coach first. This kind of training, especially at the intensity level Bruce Lee operated at throughout his life, isn't something to jump into blind without guidance. And there's no version of getting fit like Bruce Lee that's worth a torn muscle or a blown-out joint in the first week. But with consistency, patience, and the right coaching behind you, the same kind of gains in agility, speed, and strength are absolutely within reach, not overnight, but over the same kind of accumulated, unglamorous effort that built the original. If this pulled back the curtain for you even a little, stay close, there's more of this coming. Like it, share it with someone who gets something out of it, and subscribe so you don't miss where we go next.